Well, good afternoon and welcome back from lunch. I hope everybody got plenty to eat. I would normally say, since this is our last panel, that we save the best for last, but I think you'll all agree that we have four panels that are all the best. And I think this panel will be just as entertaining, but most importantly informative and educational as the previous three. So with that, I will turn it over to Professor Hoffman.
So this is the last panel of the day. When we originally conceived this conference, we wanted it to be not only substantive and to talk about the future of terrorism and to grapple with some of the key issues that we face, both in countering terrorism as it exists and also in our policies and responses to terrorism, but also to take the opportunity to reflect on the future of the discipline or the field itself. And that's what this final panel will focus on. We have three absolutely stellar representatives of three leading research institutions that have devoted themselves not only to the rigorous academic study of terrorism, but also, I think uniquely, each of the three is extremely well plugged into the policy community, military community, homeland defense, and often law enforcement and intelligence communities as well. So we'll go in alphabetical order. The first speaker will be Professor Richard English, who's the Wardlaw Professor of Politics at the University of St. Andrews, and also the director of the Handa Center for the Study of Terrorism and Political Violence. Richard's the author of 7 books, including one of the seminal studies of the Irish Republican Army, Armed Struggle, The History of the IRA. To give you some idea of his intellectual dexterity, he's also the author of a book on modern warfare. His latest book is Terrorism, How to Respond, and a forthcoming book, which dovetails very closely with my own interests, is Does Terrorism Work? A History. He was a professor at Queen's University in Belfast prior to coming to St. Andrews from 1989 to 2001. We're also extremely pleased to have Professor Gary Lafree from the University of Maryland, who's also the director of the study of terrorism and responses to terrorism, otherwise known as the START Research Center. All of you may not be aware of the historical importance of this particular moment in time, but Gary and I have known one another electronically for well over a decade, have corresponded for well over a decade, have spoken on the telephone, and yet at every previous juncture in time, we have never actually face-to-face had a personal meeting. So finally, this sort of gap in the galaxy is being redressed, and I'm really delighted that Gary was able to join us. Gary, by training, is a sociologist and a criminologist. He's the author of 60 articles and book chapters in 3 books. He's been a past president of the American Society of Criminology and has won several awards for distinction in research and statistical analysis. And then we have Dr. Ari Perliger from the Combating Terrorism Center at the United States Military Academy at West Point, and someone who I've known actually for at least a decade and a half. Ari is the author of 4 books and more than 30 articles. He has a particularly interesting approach to terrorism. He's director of terrorism studies at the Combating Terrorism Center, but he's written on social networks. He's an expert, actually, on the American far-right movement and has written, I think, one of the best analyses of modern far-right extremism, the modern far-right extremist movement in the United States. He's also written on the nexus between political parties, democracy, and terrorism, and has also written on Israeli counterterrorism measures as well. He's a graduate of the University of Haifa and has worked at West Point after coming to the U.S. Military Academy from the State University of New York at Stony Brook. So, Richard, thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Bruce, for that generous introduction, but also for the invitation to come and speak here at this wonderful conference, and to you and your colleagues for putting together a fabulous conference over these 2 days at Georgetown for reasons which I'll say more about in the next 20 minutes. I think this is a very innovative and importantly exemplary way of considering terrorism and the understanding of terrorism. And what I'm going to do today, if you'll bear with me, is to imagine the next 50 years of the study of terrorism. If we see ourselves halfway through a century of the study of terrorism, and from the days in the late 60s when scholarly endeavor began with people researching it up to now as the first 50 years, and imagine the next 50 years. And what I want to do is to think about the challenges we'll face and how we might think about how we think about dealing with them. So it's an attempt to look up from the desk, which is a difficult thing to do. One of the depressing aspects of research on terrorism now, for those of us who write books on the subject, is that even in the English language alone, there are numerous books published every day on the wretched subject, and so you have to keep intensely reading widely. But from looking up at from the desk from time to time would, I think, give us a chance to reflect in productive ways. So what I'm going to do is talk about three things. The first is I'm going to set out some problems which people frequently raise, but which I don't think we need to worry about. So there are things which people say we should worry about, but I think we can kind of push them to the side of the desk. The second thing is to say what I think is really a five-fold problem of fragmentation, which we do need to worry about. And the third part will briefly say something about how I think we might try to deal with that more serious problem. Okay, so three problems that aren't really problems, but that you'll always hear about. One is definition. Okay, so people will continually say there's a huge problem with studying terrorism because there's no consensus about defining what the word means. Now, there are issues about definition. Is it something which non-state groups alone do, or states do it as well, and so forth? We all know that in this room of experts, there's no need to adumbrate the problems. But it's incredibly normal to have a non-consensual word at the heart of what you're studying. Put another way, if it's important, it's probably non-consensual. There's no consensual definition of what nationalism means, or the state, or empire, or fascism, or colonialism, or feminism, or Marxism, or much of the way around the university. Not only that, but there's considerable common ground between scholars on what the word actually means. And even where there is a significant difference of opinion, it's not one which is immobilizing. My former principal at the University of St Andrews, Professor Louise Richardson, a wonderful scholar of terrorism, in her book What Terrorists Want, has a very different approach to defining terrorism from my own. That hasn't got in the way of a meaningful debate, because you can have different understandings but respect them, talk around them, and move on. The definitional issue will continue to be something which we have to discuss, but it's not immobilizing. A second issue which people frequently raise is the supposed dichotomy between what might be called the critical terrorism studies community and the orthodox terrorism studies community. The argument going along the lines from the former that the mainstream, supposedly orthodox terrorism studies community is too favorably disposed towards the state, considers non-state terrorism more than it should, and doesn't significantly enough consider state terrorist action, is not sufficiently committed to first-hand data, area specialism, historical context, or theoretical sophistication. Now, at the best end of the critical studies community, there are some first-class scholars. Someone like Richard Jackson, for example, is a scholar whose work I would applaud and find very positive and be very enthusiastic about. But it just doesn't seem to me that this dichotomy really exists. Much that is criticized by critical terrorism scholars as being supposedly characteristic of orthodox terrorism scholars just isn't. The notion that, for example, orthodox terrorism scholars don't think states do terrorism is just not plausible when you look at one of the founding fathers of terrorism studies, Professor Paul Wilkinson, who with Professor Hoffman co-founded CSTPV at St Andrews. The idea that orthodox terrorism scholars are not critical of government's approaches towards non-state terrorism, again, wouldn't withstand scrutiny of what, for example, another previous director of CSTPV at St Andrews, Dr. Alex Schmidt, has written. There is much common ground across what's supposedly a stark dichotomy. And the third problem, which I think is not really one that should detain us too long, is one which has most recently been adumbrated by Dr. Mark Sageman in an article published in 2014, which is the supposed stagnation in terrorism research. The argument being that although there's been huge investment in studying terrorism, in particular the period during the 15 years since the atrocity of 9/11, we haven't actually moved far forward in understanding what turns people to violence. Now, with all respect to the work of Dr. Sageman, it seems to me that this simply isn't true. It's true that we don't have a mechanical notion that if you have A, B, C, D, and E, you get a terrorist. But we don't have a mechanical notion of if you have A, B, C, D, and E, you get a baseball player, or a lawyer, or a funny person, or a boring person, okay? Because humans aren't like that, and he can't and doesn't mean that. What I think we do have, though, is a considerable amount of understanding of the complex mosaic of factors which have family resemblances between them across cases and during periods, which do lead people quite frequently to turn to violence, which involve a combination of ideological orientation, profound grievance, desire for revenge, role of mentors, of small group innovation, of other goods which are worldly, which are not necessarily to do with your ostensible motivation, reaction to the things that states do. You put all those together, ETA, the IRA, Hezbollah, Hamas, PLO, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, fit a recognizable pattern which allows for hermeneutical interpretation. You'll be told, those of you who are when I was young, I used to think that when there were problems to discuss, I'd discuss them myself. Now that my beard is grey, I think when there are problems to discuss, thank goodness young people like you will study them and I don't have to. You will be told during your careers as analysts and experts on terrorism that definition, the dichotomy between the critical and the orthodox, and stagnation are problems. They kind of are, but I'd park them. What really is the problem, second part of my talk, I think at the moment in what we're dealing with in terms of the study of terrorism, and what, if we're not careful, will get in the way of the fullest understanding of this grand global challenge in the next 50 years, is what I would refer to as an emerging five-fold fragmentation in the field of the study of terrorism, which runs along 5 continua, at each end of which are people who, though producing work which was equally important and brilliant, is not in sufficient dialogue with each other. Let me set those out. The first is a continuum which runs from those people whose commencement of engagement in the study of terrorism was pre-9/11, and those whose commencement in engagement in the study of terrorism is post-9/11. Post-9/11, there's been a wonderful explosion of research on the subject. It's immeasurably much greater and richer in terms of what's been studied. The question is whether or not there's sufficient interaction between the new wavists and the old greybeards. I'm suggesting that I think there isn't. Second is a continuum which runs between the non-US based scholars and the US based scholars. Ironically, one of Al-Qaeda's lasting achievements through the atrocity of 9/11 will have been to Americanize the study of terrorism, which was not one of their war aims, but it's undoubtedly one of the effects of their work. When I first became interested in the study of terrorism when I was a student at Oxford in the mid-1980s, people like Professor Hoffman or Martha Crenshaw and Professor Wilkinson were deeply atypical of the scholarly community. They were pioneers before it became fashionable. Okay, at that stage, the study of terrorism was something of a pagan religion, and now it's definitely mainstream. And that has had huge effects in the way in which this country, the dominant intellectual community on the planet by far, has engaged with terrorism. Okay. Again, I think the dialogue between those two ends of the continuum is not as frequent as would be beneficial to us all. A third continuum runs between those who are instinctively case study oriented and particularistic, and those who are more nomothetic and wide-angled in their approach. So the difference between the person who is only really interested in Peruvian terrorism, and if you say to them, have you seen any good films lately? They say, there's a great film about Peru. And if you say to them, who do you want to win the next FA Cup final? They say, which team has more Peruvian players in it? They only really think about Peru. Should we go out for a meal? Where's the nearest Peruvian restaurant? That sort of person who lives, breathes, and speaks Peru, okay, and knows the name of everybody who was ever in the Shining Path, okay? And on the other hand, people who could only name 3 people from the Shining Path, but who know about 500 different cases in ways which are the universe of cases. The latter tend to be more statistically sophisticated, to be asking more comparative questions, and to be engaged in more capital B, capital S political science study in the way that Americans tend to do it most frequently in some departments now. The former tend to know a lot about one thing and not much about other, and not have much interest in the rest. The fourth continuum is that between the essentially field-based, those who live in or who have had long residence in the place where the violence is actually happening, and those who are, like most of us, working in places where there's some distance from the terrorism. I've had experience of both, having lived 22 years in Belfast and then living in St Andrews, which, unless it's changed since I left, is one of the least terroristic places on the planet. I always think no one's going to bother to kill anyone in St Andrews because it's so difficult to get to that you'd certainly hit them somewhere else before they're other than catching the train to an obscure train station and a taxi from Lucas. The fifth continuum is between those who see terrorism as important because it's a symptom of something else which is more important, the tension between nation and state, the mobilizing effects of a religiously informed nationalism, economic identity or politics, and those who think that terrorism is the thing. Now, these are not sheer dichotomies. Okay, these are ideal type continua. But as I've been speaking, the pattern has been recognizable to you, and there is something of a clustering. So if I were to talk about the person who has become engaged in the study of terrorism primarily since 9/11, who's American-based, who's statistically sophisticated and has a nomothetic wide-angled engagement in it, who lives and works with the privilege of being somewhere far from where the violence is generally happening, and who thinks that terrorism is the thing to focus on, and you think about the conferences you've been to or are going to go to on the study of terrorism, you can think of people who fit that pattern, and they produce brilliant and powerful scholarship. At the other end, the person who has been studying terrorism since the 1970s, has lived in Israel, is essentially only interested in one particular case study, and thinks that it's a paradigm of something which is reflective of other issues to do with nation building and religion, and is somebody who is essentially a case study focused person. Again, you can think of names of people like that. Now, these are opposite ends of the continuum. My point is not to say that one end of any of those continua is better than the other. Okay? There is brilliant research done at both ends of each of those 5 continua, and even if you cluster people together as being typical of one end at all 5 and one end of all 5, it's not that there's better or worse. My point is that I don't think there's as much dialogue between them as would be fruitful for us all, and that the paradox of there being so much material now produced is that it's incredibly difficult to read across continua, because it's very difficult to keep up even with one kind of hermeneutical approach, let alone to be reading about people who do things in a different way. And I do think that these things relate to serious problems in how we think about terrorism. So to take the geographical one and to expand it a bit, there are many databases on terrorism now, but the best is the one which Gary runs, which is the Global Terrorism Database, and it's a fantastic and necessary resource. If you look at the GTD, around a third of all the terrorist events which are recorded in it happened in 5 countries: India, Pakistan, Iraq, Peru, and Colombia. If you take one of the leading journals in the field, Terrorism and Political Violence, and this isn't a criticism, and I'm deliberately choosing a journal which I have an involvement in editing, so it's not something where I'm having a go at someone. If you look at terrorism and political violence between the years 2000 and 2014, and look at where the authors of the articles are actually based, 1% of the authors are based in those 5 countries which produced a third of all the terrorism. Now, that's not to say that you produce better terrorism research if you live in India than if you don't. It is to say that there is something at least surely to be gleaned from those people who have an intimacy of understanding through proximity in terms of nuance, context, contacts, intuition for interpreting data, which we're profoundly missing for reasons which I fully understand. TPV is an English language journal, it works in the Anglophone world, and has to respond to the articles that are sent to it, and I understand the infrastructural difficulties that there are. But we have to overcome this if we want to understand this as a phenomenon, because otherwise we're just missing out on a vast amount of stuff which is decisive. That this has policy relevance will be obvious to anyone in this room. We've been talking much of the last 24 hours about ISIS. Okay. It seems to me that the intimacy of understanding from that kind of work, from people who are long based in those places, is of decisive potential importance analytically for scholarship, but policy-wise in terms of making the next 100 years less bloody than they otherwise will be. So what do I think should be done about this? Much easier to identify problems than to identify answers. But for once, I have the answer in front of me, okay? Because this conference is an extraordinarily rare example of all 5 of those continua being brought into dialogue. American-based scholars, non-American-based scholars, people who have become interested post-9/11, pre-9/11, case study specialists, the nomothetic, people who think terrorism is really the thing, people who don't think terrorism in itself is that important. Okay, all of those different field-based, distant, okay, all of those different points in the continuum are in the room. And the kind of conversations that previous panels on this conference, and I think that this one have had and will have, reflect the riches that you get from that kind of diversity and dialogue. But this kind of remains the exception. It's much more common, despite the fact that we all say we believe in multidisciplinarity, we tend then to go into our disciplinary home and be comfortable. So economists tend to say we love interdisciplinarity, but then publish in economist journals and talk to economists and have invitations to economists. Okay? The geographical thing, if you think about the last 30 gigs you've seen at seminars in the universities you work in, and ask about the geographical spread of the people who've been engaging in speaking. Okay? If you read bibliographies of people who are case study specialists, how many of them have engaged sufficiently with the wider set of case studies that are born in the universe of cases of those who do statistically sophisticated nomothetic work. I think what I'm suggesting is we need to rethink how we organize our seminar programs and our conferences. We need to rethink how pluralistic we are at recruitment to university centers. Okay? We need to rethink the way in which we think about where we advise younger scholars to publish. Everybody, when they're becoming a university scholar, is told interdisciplinarity and multidisciplinarity are great. But then if you're a psychologist and you want to get a job in a psychology department at a university, but you think it's more interesting to publish in a history journal, you find you won't get shortlisted because the psychologists will say that's not a psychology journal. Okay? In the United Kingdom, we have a research audit where the United Kingdom is... This is being filmed, so I've got to be careful what I say, otherwise I'll lose my job. But the United Kingdom is absurdly over-audited, okay? And we have this research audits, but the panels are disciplinary, and people will say in anthropology panels, you know, that's not really anthropology because it's published in an evolutionary biology journal, or that's not really philosophy because it's published in a maths journal, or that's not really political science because she's a historian, okay? We've got to get over that. We've also got to get over the way in which we give reading lists to students. Okay, we've got to think about genuinely pluralistic reading lists for people along those continua. And what I'm going to suggest is that what you should think about doing as part of your intellectual work is identifying the best cases of people who work at the other end of the continuum from which you feel most comfortable, and thinking about what hermeneutically is only possible through the way they see the world. And that forces you to think hermeneutically about what's only possible for you to see the world. Uncharacteristically, I've spent the last couple of days praising not my own books, but other people's. So let me have another go. If you look at Bruce Hoffman's book, Anonymous Soldiers, which I mentioned yesterday, now the definitive study of the Jewish terrorism which helped to produce the State of Israel in the mid-20th century. There are certain things that you can only understand about that subject through doing the kind of archivally focused, richly data-specific work that Bruce did. Okay, and no database is going to give you that from a wide-angle case. But there are other things that databases will be able to give you, which you won't be able to get. So let's think about how this works in practice and what might be possible in the future. Okay? What I'm suggesting is that I think both the people who are working on wide-angled nomothetic scholarship and the people who are case study obsessives will benefit and enrich their work by engagement with the others. Let me give you an example. The economist Alan Kruger at Princeton made the point that if you look at the universe of cases in terrorism, the norm, or at least the most predominant pattern, is that people engaged in terrorism are likely to be slightly wealthier and better educated than the community from which they come and which they act as a vanguard to. But he makes the interesting point that Northern Ireland was an exception to this in terms of education and wealth and the people who are involved in terrorism. Now, most of the people who just are interested in Northern Ireland never really asked that question about why that was, whether that was necessary, inevitable, or contingent. If contingent, what made it the way that it worked. But it's a question which you're prompted to by looking at the wide-angle cases. But similarly, I think, and I suspect that Professor Lefree would agree with me, the database, the value of the databases is enriched and multiplied by the degree to which case study specialists from various areas engage with it and offer their materials and questions about it. We've been talking this morning very brilliantly in the session which we had about torture and enhanced interrogation techniques. If we look at that in the way that I'm suggesting we can expand the way we discuss it to enrich even the very valuable discussion we had this morning. There's work by neuroscientists on torture. Shane O'Mara's book, Why Torture Doesn't Work, looks at what happens to the brain from a neuroscientific point of view when you stress it in the way you do in terms of torture, and argues that the very things that you want to get in terms of the eliciting of specific information are rendered very unlikely if you actually torture people. Philosophers have engaged in the ticking time bomb debate. Neuroscientists have looked at the brain. Game theorists have looked at how it works. You've got people who've got the kind of expertise that we heard this morning from our brilliant speakers on the subject in terms of what they bring. I'm suspecting that, and these are the two concluding comments, if we try to get over what I'm calling a five-fold fragmentation, the chances of our moving cumulatively forward as a scholarly community and demonstrating what you might call the known knowns that we do have are greater. Now, it's not that we're going to find uniformity on most questions, because scholarship isn't like that, and humans aren't like that. But it is the case that there are things that we do know that we know, but we don't say them as loudly and as emphatically as we could do, because we say them in 5 different places or 20 different places rather than in one. Okay? So in the case of the politics, again, another example of it in terms of ISIS, Bruce made a brilliant point this morning, that the context of ISIS in terms of the kind of capacity that they have, having territory and safe haven context where they're actually controlling their own safe haven, is a transformed threat to the West, but also clearly to the people in the territory that they inhabit. But had there been the kind of debate post 9/11 amongst scholars, which I'm suggesting is possible, where people from all different kinds of backgrounds, experience, expertise, historians as well as game theorists, political scientists as well as anthropologists, and said, this is what we think we know about what happens when you do what you're about to do in 2003 in Iraq. And let's bear in mind, there's not a single first-class historian of Iraq who thought what was promised in 2003 was even halfway credible. Had this happened, and had we had a scholarly community which was more united rather than fragmented, some of the worst excesses of what we've done would have been got rid of, and we wouldn't probably now have ISIS. What defines history is far more what states do in response to terrorism than what terrorists actually do. What I'm suggesting is not that scholars are in a position where they can tell governments what to do and they'll do it. Of course, that would be absurd. What I am saying is that the little we can do as scholars is to agree across those fragmented lines as much as we cumulatively can, so that we can provide the kind of analysis that we think is most persuasive and cumulatively agreed upon with the most uniform and unified voice that we can. Whether that'll make a vast difference in terms of how the 21st century develops, I don't know. I do know that it's the only chance we have in the next 50 years of making the maximum use of the scholarship which all of you guys exemplify. Thank you very much indeed.
That's great. I think Gary is going to use PowerPoint. I don't know if
This should work, right? Great. Okay, well, it's a real pleasure to be here. I want to thank Bruce for the invitation. And it's actually great to have such a distinguished panelist as collaborators this afternoon. And I would say if Professor English's comments are typical of the conference, it must have been a very successful last couple of days. At least I find many of the comments you're making quite interesting. And actually, they dovetail to some extent. I was trying to put myself into those categories, and you're absolutely right, I think, about those being some of the key cut points. And we actually have these discussions frequently at our center about, are we reaching out to other parts of the world where we may not have the same amount of strength? And I think my talk today, we didn't rehearse these, obviously, or coordinate them, so I think my talk will actually bring out sort of where my biases are in this whole thing. So it's good to see that as an introduction. I would say that I think maybe Richard was hinting at this in his comments, but to some extent, those who study terrorism seem to be a pretty pessimistic group when I look back at the last 20 or 30 years. Nearly 3 decades ago, historians Alex Schmidt and his colleague Youngman described terrorism research as, quote, impressionistic and superficial with far-reaching generalizations based on episodal evidence. 13 years ago, many of you in this room will know psychologist Andrew Silke, who concluded that, quote, this is actually my favorite put-down of terrorism research, terrorism study exists on a diet of fast food research, quick, cheap, ready to hand, but nutritionally dubious. So this is about 11 years ago. And just 3 years ago, in an article in the Chronicle of Higher Education, our colleague Mark Sageman described, quote, the disappointing state of the field of terrorism studies largely consisting of wild speculation without foundation. So I guess what I'm going to say this afternoon, I'm going to offer a much more optimistic assessment that, and I think I would agree with Richard's comments, that in fact we have made a good deal of progress in the last 20 or 30 years in terms of developing a scientific basis for the study of terrorism and counterterrorism. We've seen major increases in terrorism-related research appearing in mainstream journals across the social and behavioral sciences in areas that really had pretty much neglected terrorism in the past, including my home field of criminology. We also see evidence that terrorism research is gaining traction as a serious specialization among many social and behavioral science fields. So I'll just give a couple of examples to try to make this point from criminology, because I know that one the best. Within the American Society of Criminology, which is, I think, the largest criminal justice professional association in the world, terrorism and responses to terrorism was first added to the annual meetings as a specialty topic in 2005, which fits actually Richard's comments about the Americanization of terrorism research following 9/11. Since then, the number of papers on terrorism and responses to terrorism has continued to increase. The 2015 meetings of the ASC, which were held here in Washington, it was interesting. There were actually more papers delivered on the topic of terrorism than on many traditional criminology topics like organized crime, white-collar crime, and so on. In fact, last year, the ASC even added a special division on terrorism research. So it's kind of gone from 0 to 100 very, very rapidly. And it's not, of course, just criminology. Terrorism studies courses have been added to university curricula across the country and around the world. So I would agree with Mark Sageman, his comments also about that research on terrorism has not been funded as extensively as it should be, but clearly there's far more funding now than at any previous point in history. And I think Richard was probably pointing to this point as well. Terrorism is a complicated issue to conceptualize, to measure, to define, to study. But I would agree with Richard. I'm not convinced it's any more difficult than many of the other topics that social scientists and behavioral scientists routinely are interested in studying. You look at, is it harder to study human trafficking, hate crime, ethnic cleansing, aggression, corruption, and the list goes on and on. I don't see any inherent reason why terrorism is any more difficult than many other topics. So what I'd like to do in the brief time that I have is talk about 4 areas of research on terrorism and counterterrorism where I think we can expect to see substantial growth in the future. Keeping in mind that predicting anything in the social sciences is probably the most precarious task that we can engage in. And I want to make it clear that my list is both limited and very idiosyncratic. The issues I've chosen do not by any means cover all of the likely new developments, and I've concentrated on some that I find interesting and also some that we are actually engaged in research on at the START Center. So the first one I'd like to point out as an area of future growth is the continued growth of automated terrorism data collection. When we started collecting our global terrorism database in 2001, this is what it looked like. And Bruce will have, I think, some sympathy here because he was, of course, a pioneer in the area of collecting this sort of data and as the originator of the St. Andrews RAND terrorism database. These early terrorism event databases were originally handwritten or typed. Most of the information came from wire services, especially Reuters. Somebody was telling me a moment ago that he has a connection with Reuters. And major newspapers with a global focus. So we'd look at the New York Times, British Financial Times, and others. Today, the data collection process for these event databases is completely different. The GTD now begins with a universe of about 2 million articles published daily worldwide in order to identify the relatively small set of articles that describe terrorist attacks. Our team uses Boolean filters and identifies attack-specific keywords to help us decide which articles to include. Obviously, with 2 million articles, we don't have the bandwidth to have humans look at all those articles. So we've developed a set of filters that experience has shown are especially likely to identify articles about terrorist attacks. Right now, it turns out in our database, the 3 best words for finding a bona fide terrorist attack are number 1, attack, 2, bomb, and 3, blast. And there are always surprises in how these Boolean search filters work. In fact, one surprise to me is the word terror is not a very good predictor of a terrorist attack. The reason is too often the word terror is used to refer to something like the New York Islanders terrorized the Ottawa Senators. So people in the media use terror pretty frequently in situations that we aren't terribly interested in. So we then, after we've narrowed the field somewhat, we use natural language processing methods to remove duplicate stories. And if you're in the open source database business, The real growing problem as the fire hose of worldwide media continues to increase are duplicates. So, for example, in the next slide, I've got on the bottom right-hand side there, you'll see a spike in these are the total number of cases we are analyzing to include the GTD. That spike is the Boston Marathon bombing. So basically, whenever there's an incident like Paris, Brussels, Boston, Mumbai, you name it, we get this huge spike. There might be 50,000 stories on the Brussels bombing, for example, around the world. So you don't have enough bandwidth to look at 50,000 stories. So you have to come up with a way of sifting through all those and figuring out which ones are the most important. We're finding that if an article matches about 80% seems to be the sweet spot right now, that it's likely that we can exclude it without losing any information. But in addition to that, you have this whole problem of what if the sources disagree? Who do you trust? So we've had to develop this whole sort of status hierarchy of the media so that, for example, we're much more likely to treat seriously a story in the New York Times or the London Financial Times than the voice of jihad. So in other words, we have to come up with ranking for all of these different categories. So the machine learning models then classify the remaining articles as relevant or not relevant. And this works pretty much like a Netflix account in how it tells you which movies you want to watch next. So our human coders continue to record cases. The machine learning system tends to, or works on getting those cases to be more accurate over time. So based on these algorithms, we then reduce the stream of data to about 15 to 20,000 articles per month, which is small enough that we can finish the process manually. Then finally, after passing through all these filters, we have a team of about 25 researchers who actually do the coding. Now, over the years, in fact, right when we began, as long ago as 10, 12 years ago, companies like IBM and other computer companies said, well, why are you wasting all this time with human beings? Why don't we just automate this process? And there are some fully automated systems out there. Probably the best known of these is Phil Schroet's GDELT and the various offsprings of GDELT. But in my opinion, they're still not nearly as accurate as the machine-human interface. So the machines are really good, are necessary for reducing the total flow because you just can't do it with humans. But humans are still better at making the judgment calls at the end of the database. But I have to say the situation is constantly evolving. Just like you've got this ongoing contest with computers taking on people playing chess or Go, the computers do get better at it over time. So anyway, I think we'll continue to see a lot of growth in this area. Another area where I think we've seen a lot of improvement and we will continue to see improvement is with regard to geospatial analysis of terrorism. When we started a map like this, I guess you probably can't see that too well in the back, but would have been impossible. But increasingly, a lot of the data we're getting is geocoded. If you can see this in the back, the yellow areas are essentially the hot zones right now. This was in 2013. It looks pretty similar to 2014. You can see this whole band of attacks in sub-Saharan Africa. You see a band, you see not a whole lot of activity in North America, a little band of activity in the top of South America, lots of course cases in the Middle East and South Asia. And we can now do this for any part of the world. So we can look at terrorist attacks in India, for example, in recent years. So you see most of the action is in the vicinity of Bangladesh. The rest of the country, very little action. Although, I don't know if you can see this from the back, but of course Pakistan and Afghanistan are pretty much covered in attacks. Sri Lanka would have been in the past, but no longer is. So you get these sorts of, I think this has given us a lot more ability to do all kinds of complicated analyses that just wasn't possible. And I'll give you just one example of this, and this is from the field of criminology. Criminologists are very interested in this thing called near-repeat crime distributions. I don't know if any of you have been the victim of a burglary ever? Anybody? Okay. So if you're the victim of a burglary, you want to take it very seriously because burglars tend to go back to the same place or the same neighborhood. So basically, you can imagine and big city police departments are doing this already quite a bit in the United States. So you can imagine giving every address in a particular community a number based on their chances of being burglarized. And that number would change based on where burglaries are actually happening. And we know that burglaries are highly concentrated, basically. So in other words, if you've been the victim of a burglary, your chances go up for a while. And you can see they decay pretty rapidly. So when you get about 50 days after the burglary, you're almost back to normal. And by the time you get to 200 days, you're back to normal. But when you get burglarized, the chances of your neighbors getting burglarized also go up. So you can look at this sort of near-repeat phenomenon with something like burglary. And we've been doing some work, actually, I've been working on this with Jeff Brantingham at University of Southern California. And somewhat to our surprise, when we applied the same kind of logic to improvise explosive devices in Iraq, you get a very similar kind of a metric. It looks very much like burglary. So essentially, if there was an IED in a particular place, very likely to repeat until something happens probably to stop the success, and eventually the area is no more dangerous than other areas. So with this kind of information, though, there's quite a bit of, rather than randomly patrolling, it tells you where your hotspots are likely to be and gives you some idea of how those hotspots change over time. And we've been experimenting with some other ways of looking at this and using this to actually give some sort of useful policy information in terrorist events. And I'll just mention one. This is a study that was published a couple of years ago. We took ETA in Spain and the FMLN in El Salvador, and we geocoded all of their attacks in El Salvador and in Spain. And we were especially interested in what we called microcycles. A microcycle, by our definition, was an attack that happened very close to a previous attack, both in space and time. So it's a cluster of attacks. It's essentially a localized burst of activity. When we began classifying the thousands of attacks by ETA and the FMLN using this kind of methodology, we found that they were pretty spread out in terms of space and time. In these charts I've got on the board, ETA's on the top, FMLN on the bottom. On one axis we've got distance from the previous attack, and on the top there's a time frame. But what was really interesting about the findings also is that they're highly clustered, very much clustered in the very top couple of squares of these tables. So in other words, for ETA, 52% of all attacks happened within microcycles that were within 2 weeks and 5 miles of each other. 60% happened in microcycles that were within 2 weeks and 10 miles of each other. For the FMLN, it was even greater concentration. 67% of FMLN attacks happened within 2 weeks and 5 miles of each other. 81% within microcycles of 2 weeks and 10 miles of each other. So then this got us thinking, well, could we use this information the way that big city police departments are using it to deploy police officers to stop burglaries? In other words, are microcycles different? And we found some evidence that indeed they are. We found, for example, if an attack involves an assassination, it's not particularly likely to be a part of a microcycle. It doesn't get repeated. It's a one-off sort of thing. On the other hand, bombings are significantly more likely to be part of microcycles. So in other words, if you get a bombing, expect more of them to happen until you figure out a good strategy for avoiding it. Armed assaults, one-off. They don't tend to be repeated. But when you have fatal attacks, you do have a tendency for those to be repeated, at least for the ETA and the FMLN in this particular case. We even found that these things predict locations to some extent. Attacks in the national capital tend to be repeated. They're very bursty, so you tend to get a lot of them in the same locations rapidly. On the other hand, this next one is interesting. In the provincial regional capital, that was true for ETA, but not the FMLN. And if you know a little bit about these cases, this makes good sense, because ETA wanted to carve out their own state in Spain, whereas the FMLN wanted to take over the whole capital, or the whole country. They weren't interested in a regional capital. And also we find attacks that happen within the groups, a sort of defended space where their main power base is, are more likely to be repeated. So in short, these results obviously are very simplistic and preliminary, but I think they would have been impossible 10 or 12 years ago, and the level of sophistication with these geospatial analyses just continues to get better and better. A third point I wanted to make is I think we're going to see a continuing increase in linkages across existing data sets, which is going to essentially leverage the utility of these individual data sets. There, I think, has long been a dearth of studies in the social science area about how specific counterterrorism measures or anti-terrorism efforts impact the behavior and activities of terrorists or potential terrorists. That we don't have a lot of good information on how effective various sorts of policies used by governments for counterterrorism are, in part because a lot of times governments aren't very interested in sharing that information. But I think we're going to see improvement in this area. And I brought with me, I think, a fairly primitive example of how this could be done. It's an example where we took the global terrorism database and then we did an analysis of the many different things that the British tried to reduce terrorism in Northern Ireland during the Troubles. And we come up with examples like this, which may be a little bit hard to read. I brought just a series of examples to make the point. Falls curfew, internment, Operation Motorman, criminalization, ulsterization, the Lowell incident, the Gibraltar incident. And we looked at each of these incidents and we looked at what happened to terrorist attacks after the incident. And basically, I think I've got a thing here, yeah. So basically this side of the line are things where terrorism increased afterwards, this side of the line where they declined afterwards. And we found that basically, and we controlled for lots of other sorts of explanations as well, but we found basically a lot of the policies being tried in the early days in particular did not result in the desired effect. In fact, there was a tendency for terrorism to not decline but to increase. So I think we're going to get a lot more research like this that's a lot more sophisticated. We're starting to see some of this already showing up in the research literature. Another project I'll just mention very rapidly that we're doing right now at the START Center is a project called Transit. This is all open source data, but we've essentially taken 12 different transportation methods and put them all into this huge database. So we look at airport, we look at roads, we look at trains, we look at boats, we even have submarines, fast boats, submersibles, anything that gets you from point A to point B. We then superimposed on that database all the information we had about terrorist organizations and also organized crime organizations, including whether they are partnered or whether they're enemies, whether they get together. Now, with that information, you can start to look at the routes that are most likely to be followed for all kinds of behavior that you might be interested in. So you're interested perhaps in the movement of nuclear materials, drugs, weapons, or perhaps the illegal movement of people like human trafficking or terrorism. And for example, you remember a couple of years ago there was this issue in Mexico where a hospital had lost some nuclear material and at first they weren't sure where it ended up or whether someone had nefarious purposes for having this material. With these data we could talk about where the material could be an hour, a week, 2 weeks, based on the available transportation routes. And I just brought one example that we've been using to look at how foreign fighters might return back to Europe. In other words, based on all of these different transportation hubs, all of which are unclassified, but my point is when you put them all together, they have a lot more power, perhaps. And what we've seen that's especially important, you can see the red line, oh, maybe you can't see the red lines. Oh, that's very faint. Well, if you could see the red lines, they're in here, basically. What happens with these transportation hubs is you develop choke points. So in other words, a lot of different transportation methods end up coming together. It could be because of geographical reasons, like mountain chains or rivers or lakes. But for a variety of reasons, there are choke points in most of these transit hubs. And so if you've got limited resources and you're trying to figure out where to stop human trafficking, terrorism, whatever the category, it gives you a much better idea of where to put those resources. And it turns out, in our analysis, most of the choke points are in the Greek islands, either in ports or cities. And when you do some visualization of that, the most common routes or pathways for foreign fighters we think are likely to come through Turkey and part of the former Yugoslavia. So the point I'm trying to make here, though, is work like this can take a number of different databases. By putting them together, get a lot more interesting. And finally, I think we're going to see a lot of new and engaging work using social media for studying terrorism and responses to terrorism. And for example, I'll just talk about one example of this that we're engaged in right now through a National Science Foundation project. We're using social media to predict reactions to terrorism and also to predict terrorism threats. we started out in the example I've got for we're using Twitter feeds. And we used as a test bed the Boston Marathon attacks because by accident we had really good survey data. The Department of Homeland Security was paying for surveys that happened to happen before and after the Boston Marathon, so we had some good sort of test bed information. And, you know, we can do a fairly detailed amount of analysis on Twitter feeds around this period. You see in the middle, if you recall, the Boston Marathon had this sort of, they had first the initial explosions, and then the manhunt that came afterwards. And it might be a little bit hard to see, but the needle definitely moves in terms of Twitter feeds during the Boston Marathon, in terms of people tweeting about it, of course. And you can imagine systems where we could have this kind of early warning system for all kinds of conflicts, for all kinds of violent confrontations that are happening. And we could perhaps get that in close to real time because Twitter is delivered in real time. We can also do things like look at how it affects interactions with the police. Interestingly, Boston police were very highly praised during this period. There was a big attempt or a big effort on the part of the public to reach out to the police much more than in other situations. I don't have time to go into it right now, but we actually did something similar with Charlie Hebdo in Paris. It did not happen in Paris. The French police did not get a sort of big boost in terms of social media activity during this period of time. So one of the things we want to figure out is, you know, what kind of a job are the police doing, what kind of credibility, what kind of legitimacy do they get, and so on. We also can look at even emotional reactions over time. And what we're finding, the chief emotional reactions you're getting in the Boston Marathon are a big spike in fear, decrease in happiness, which is consistent with what we're finding also in the survey data. Only the cool thing is you get it in real time. You can almost get it while it's happening or shortly after it's happening. So we're working now on a much larger project where we're using these sorts of social media sources as well as traditional social science to look at conflict, political violence, and terrorism in sub-Saharan Africa. But I think there's going to be a lot more work in this area in the future. So I'm probably running out of time. I'll just go to a few conclusions. I do believe that researchers are making progress in understanding terrorism and responses to terrorism, and I expect that this progress is likely to continue in the future. And in particular, I think we're likely to see progress in automated data collection, more sophisticated geospatial analysis, increasing integration of useful databases, and the growing use of social media data. And I think one of the main reasons I disagree with the pessimistic assessment of the future in terms of research on terrorism is I think many of those who make these claims are not correctly assessing what the likely contributions of social sciences can be in any field of inquiry. And I was interested that Richard made exactly the same point. In many cases, including terrorism studies, much of what the social science can offer is not so much information about what we know, but caution about what we do not know. And this is one of the main points. I'm working on a book right now with Martha Crenshaw that's supposed to be published, I hope, soon by Brookings Press. And this is one of the main points that we are trying to make in this book, in fact. We argue that in the past decade or so, if you look at some of the main contributions made by research on terrorism, I think three of the most important are as follows. First, despite their notoriety, terrorist attacks in most parts of the world during most periods are relatively rare, and therefore it's very difficult to formulate general policies and to do complicated statistical analysis. Why do we concentrate on ETA and the FMLN as opposed to other groups in the analysis I showed you? Because they're active. They're much easier to study because they have these big footprints, but groups with far fewer attacks are much more difficult to come up with any kind of statistical analysis. Secondly, research shows us that the responsibility for attacks is often ambiguous or altogether unknown. And this makes punishment very difficult and complicates our understanding of threats. In many cases, about 50% of the 150,000 attacks in our database, we never know who did it, basically. And even sometimes with highly profile attacks, we don't know. And finally, research has shown that many attacks are carried out by individuals or groups that are short-lived, inchoate, rapidly evolving, and this further impedes our ability to come up with consistent and rational policy responses. And obviously, if you can't come up with rational policy responses, it's more difficult for prevention. And if you think about all three of these insights from this project are not so much what we know about terrorism as warnings about what we do not know about terrorism. But surely public policy on terrorism benefits from taking to heart not only evidence for the known knowns, but also for the known unknowns. So I have no illusions that research is going to solve all the problems and challenges posed by terrorism and our responses to it. But I do believe that as scientific research on terrorism matures, we will be able to do a much better job of understanding the phenomena and also do a better job of mitigating its effects and perhaps even preventing it altogether in some cases. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks very much.
Hi everyone, good afternoon. I would like also to thank Bruce and the organizers for inviting me and for the opportunity to participate in this wonderful conference. Actually, my initial intention was actually also to give my thoughts about the current state of the field, talks a little bit about, the main deficiencies in the current research on terrorism, and talk a little bit about, the future potentials of terrorism research. But then I read a piece in the New York Times that was published, I think it was a month ago, about the profiling of terrorists. And after I read the piece, I was left completely frustrated, because in many ways it showed me that there's still, in the field of terrorism study, there's still black holes that we fail to deal with. And when I'm talking about black holes, I'm talking about these areas or niches within the field of terrorism studies that we invest a lot of time and a lot of research in order to decipher. Nonetheless, we fail in the most basic, I would guess, scientific procedures in order to deal with these kind of challenges. So I decided to actually present a research project that I've just completed with two colleagues, Gabe Kohler-Derrick from Harvard and Ami Pedster from UT Austin. And this will be an ISQ. But in many ways, I think this research project will allow me to talk about the major challenges that we're facing when we're trying to study various aspects or facets of terrorism, as well as pointing out some future directions that will enable us to really gain a better understanding of the more challenging aspects of studying terrorism. So the basic question that we were asking is why we failed so far to profile terrorists. As you may know, for the last 20, 30 years, both academics as well as practitioners are trying to come up with some kind of a consensual profile, right? Trying to identify what exactly are the socioeconomic and psychological characteristics that really define those who decide to join violent groups. And we failed. There's no consensual profile, and different scholars raise different answers or try to provide different excuses or explanations to this ongoing failure. Some of them, especially 15, 20 years ago, many of them indicated that we just don't have enough data, right? It's extremely difficult to collect data about those individuals who join terrorist organizations. The organizations themselves are not happy to release information about their members, and governments as well are very reluctant to release information about members of terrorist groups. So we just don't have enough data. Once we'll have data, we'll be able to overcome this challenge. However, today the situation is different. We actually have data now, and there's multiple data sets that actually provide significant information about the socioeconomic background of those members of terrorist organizations. Nonetheless, we still didn't make some significant progress. So some people are talking about a selection bias with the data that we have. In other words, we have data, but we have data about specific individuals or individuals that are fulfilling specific roles within these organizations, such as the leaders of these groups, or suicide bombers, or foreign fighters, and so on and so forth. Some scholars arguing that there's no such profile because, terrorist organizations are operating in different settings, in different contexts. That means that in different settings, different people will decide to join these militant groups. And instead of trying to build some kind of a consensual profile, we really need to look into what kind of people will join terrorist groups in different settings, in different circumstances. We would like to argue that actually there's a different problem, or that the real reason for this ongoing failure is actually failure in conceptualization. And what do I mean by failure in conceptualization? In many ways, we really never really decided who is a terrorist, or what the word or what the designation terrorist actually means. Are we talking about the leaders of the groups? Are we talking about the suicide bombers? Are we talking about the driver that actually get the suicide bomber to the location of the attack? Are we talking about the engineer that actually construct the explosive vest? Who exactly is the terrorist? Can we actually argue that the leader of a terrorist organization that probably was never engaged in any kind of violent operation is a real terrorist? What about, again, a one-time assistant that actually, probably just deliver something from point A to point B, as a favor to one of the operatives of the organization? Is he a terrorist? And so we really never really, so while we invested a lot of time and resources and energy in trying to identify or in trying to construct the definition of a terrorism, of what terrorism is, we really never invested enough time and resources in defining who is the terrorist. And more specifically, we really ignore the fact that terrorist organizations are a very complex frameworks that includes different roles, different functions. And there's really no reason to believe that the people who fulfill these different functions will have similar characteristics, the same way that we don't expect any employee of Microsoft to have the same socioeconomic background as Bill Gates. Nonetheless, when you're looking at the terrorism literature, especially the one who's trying to focus on the profiling, there's, in many cases, there's a complete disregard to the fact that we're talking about very complex entities. So the first thing that we need to understand is that there are different functions within these organizations, and it makes sense that each of these functions will attract people with different skill set, with different background, with different inclinations, with different motivations, right? And I know that Gary is a criminologist, so I know that, criminologists will never assume that a white-collar criminal will have the same profile as serial murder, for example. But for some reason, terrorism scholars in many cases believe that all terrorists are the same. The second problem is that we're not really asking the right question. So most people who are trying to develop the profile of terrorists try to understand what are the characteristics that will push a specific individuals to engage in a very extreme manifestations of violence. Many people, when they're thinking about terrorists, they think about people who are willing to do very cruel things, beheading or killing innocent people or participating in operations that leads to the killing of innocent people. So they're trying to understand what are the characteristics, what are the psychological traits that will drive specific individuals to engage in these kind of cruel acts of violence. But this is not the question that we should ask. The question that we should ask is not who is willing to participate in the execution of violence. The question that we need to ask is who is a person who is willing to join an organization that, among many other things, also employ violence, right? The same way, and I'm coming from West Point, so everybody who was part of the Army knows that 90%, 85% of the people in the Army will never be in battle, will never participate in any real battlefield operation, right? Nonetheless, in the same way, we won't assume that just people who are skillful in battlefield operations should join the Army. That's not the case. The same goes for terrorist organizations. So this is what we need to ask. And again, we're not asking the right question. And this is true, by the way. Again, all these aspects or all these, I guess, problems are problems that are reflected in many other facets of the field, unfortunately. Secondly, and I was a bit surprised that Gary didn't mention that, but I think there's a growing understanding that we cannot just focus on the formal structure of terrorist organizations. We need also to look into the informal aspects. And I think that in the last 10 years, there's a serious progress in the usage of social network analysis in order to really understand the informal roles of individuals within the organization. Someone can have a very limited formal role within the organization. Nonetheless, he's the glue that connects the different components of the terrorist network. But we will never know that if we will not try really to understand the social structure of the group, right? Who are those individuals that fulfill all these informal social roles within the organization that eventually makes the organization works? And everyone who actually manages an organization know that beyond the formal functions and beyond the formal roles that each one of the people has, there's also some other aspects of their job that we expect them to fulfill. But we'll never really get to that if we will not look into the social structure of the group. So by missing all these points, we're actually failing really to understand what are the right questions that we need to ask in order to come up with some, or in order to actually to make some progress in these specific questions of what is the terrorist profile, or if we can actually develop some kind of effective profiling. And I just want to, and again, just to further illustrate what I've just said, this study by Kruger and Malikova, probably the most cited article, or one of the most cited articles in the field in the last 15 years. And it became almost as a benchmark in the field. And I guess that most of you are familiar with the piece, most of you are familiar with their bottom line conclusion, but they basically fail to address all these questions that I've just raised in many ways. They are focusing on very specific type of members of these groups, while disregard the fact that other type of members may have different type of profiling and may be indeed motivated by economic motivations. For example, they're using public polls. That means that they're not really looking into what really characterizes those who are willing to join the organization, but actually people who are willing to support political violence in general. In many ways, I don't want to waste too much time, but basically they fail in all these aspects. And this is just one example. If you're looking at large at the terrorism studies literature, you see these issues coming up again and again. So we wanted to provide some kind of an alternative. So instead of asking what characterize people who join terrorist organizations, we wanted to ask different questions. What characterize people who joining different functions within these organizations? So the real question is not, and I don't think I think it will be extremely difficult, if not impossible, really, to develop a profile of the people who join these organizations. Because again, these organizations are extremely diverse, and they really can be open to people from different backgrounds, with different skill set, with different motivations, right? The same way that it will be extremely difficult to identify the characteristics of people who join a specific corporate firm. But we can try to make some progress in order to identify what characterizes the individuals that fulfill specific functions within these groups. So, for example, what characterizes those who are willing to fulfill battlefield roles within the organizations? What characterizes those who are the spiritual leaders of the group? What characterizes those who are willing to really invest significant personal resources in the organization? So basically, we came up with a very basic argument. We argue that in each one of these dependent variables, we'll see a different type of socioeconomic profile. And just to be more clear, for example, we argue that members of terrorist organizations who are engaged in violence, that actually participate in the execution of violence, will have different characteristics than those who do not participate in violent operations, right? There's a difference between those who are willing to cross this threshold and really participate in the execution of violence and those who are willing to fulfill various administrative roles within these groups. There's also differences between those who are really willing to invest in the organization and those who are looking for just short-term material benefits, right? Those who are joining the organization just because they want some kind of a salary or some other material benefits. Okay. We also argue that we'll see that people who fulfill leadership role will have different characteristics than those who fulfill different other types of role, non-leadership roles, or those who stay for the long term and those who stay for the short term. We also argue that we'll see different characteristics based on the social influence of the individual within the group, right? Those who are extremely influential have high level of, or have a high rate of connections to different members of the group that have significant social influence within the group will have different characteristics than those who have limited social influence within the group. Basically, what we are trying to do is to catch the overall formal and informal elements of the structure of terrorist groups and try to identify which kind of people will be attracted to this specific roles. In order to do that, we use the data set of members of Islamist networks operating in different parts of the globe in different times. We conduct social network analysis on each one of them. We also collected information about the socioeconomic background of each one of these individuals through various resources. And then basically we use very basic set of independent variables, really covers the most common and basic socioeconomic characteristics, and then we use as the independent variable the set of variables that really covers the formal and the informal role of the individual within the group. And then we started to run some models, and indeed, as we expected, there are differences between those who are willing really to engage in violence and those who are not willing to engage in violence. For example, those who are willing to engage in violence are those who are enjoying high biographical availability, for example, those who cannot really contribute to the organization on the ideological level because they don't have really any kind of ideological education, and so on and so forth. We also look into those who are willing to invest in the organization. That means that they're willing to attend training camps, willing to stay for longer times. And indeed, we've seen that these are people who have more personal capital, more educated, and so on. Also, when we looked at some of the informal roles within the organization, again, the models were significant. And really, I don't want to waste your time on the specifics of our findings, but really what we wanted really to illustrate through this specific piece was the need to adopt a new approach to these kind of ongoing questions that we are dealing with for the last 30, 40 years, right? And we need to reevaluate if we're asking the right question, if we really understand the complexities of the issues that we're dealing with. And I'm becoming more and more concerned. And we can see that when we're looking into the new type of literature that we see in the last 5, 6, 7 years. I think it's great that we have a lot of grad students that are capable in using super sophisticated methodological analysis in order to understand this kind of dynamics. But I'm extremely worried that many of these students have almost zero familiarity with the context of the violence that they are studying. So it's not uncommon that I'm getting an article for review, and it's very clear to me that the person who wrote about the Tamils, for example, he's great. His methodology is extremely solid. The data is great, but he has no idea about the politics in Sri Lanka. Nothing. So while he gets some really interesting results, he has very limited ability really to interpret the results and understand their meaning, really. And I'm just worried that we are actually nurturing a new generation of terrorism scholars who, while are extremely efficient in utilizing new methodologies, which I think is great, nonetheless, they're really missing the understanding that context is important. History is important. Having some regional understanding of these groups or having some understanding of the regional dynamics of where these groups are operating is important. So we need both sides of the equation. And I think, when I'm listening to both of you, I think understanding, indeed, this combination could be very powerful. I'm just worried that we don't really trying to encourage our students to understand the importance of this kind of joining forces, both sides of the discipline, or both facets of the discipline, indeed. I'm also worried a little bit about our tendency to, and I'm trying to find the right words for that. And it's interesting because in the last ISA, I was a discussant in a panel of 5 scholars, really nice people, who all of them belong to what we call today critical terrorism studies, right? And when I read their papers, I think some of them were really interesting. Some of them were really interesting case studies. Nonetheless, I'm really concerned about the fact that, you know, many of them are trying to invent the wheel again and again. You know, so it starts with, you know, even the basic issue of state terrorism, right? So we can debate how we should deal with state terrorism, but we at least should acknowledge, for example, that the root causes of state terrorism are fundamentally different than the root causes of non-state terrorism. So from an analytical perspective, does it make sense to include them under the same analytical designation or under the same analytical framework if the basic explanations for these 2 social phenomena are different, right? The fact that states are using violence in order to instill fear in their citizens, does that mean that we should necessarily see that as terrorism? I'm not sure. Is there any regime that didn't use some kind of measures in order to deter its population, to instill fear in their... Even when talking about democracy, they are using some basic mechanism of deterrence in order to force people to obey the law, right? Again, so I'm a bit concerned. And I'm also concerned about the lack of clarity in terms of building effective analytical and conceptual framework when I see this new type of literature. So I'll be happy to answer questions, but I'll end by that. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, let's go back.
Should we swap? Okay. Yeah, excuse me.
Sure.
Well, you can see the professionalism and academic expertise of the 3 panelists, that they were each bang on time, and Ari ended actually a little sooner. I mean, those of you who have been in my classes know that I'm an inveterate pessimist on the, at least in the future of terrorism trends, but I have to admit, even myself, I was inspired and encouraged by all 3 of the briefings that we heard, or all 3 of the presentations that tackled this from different perspectives. I think Richard's excellent analysis and exegesis of some of the bifurcations that have undermined the field. Gary's, I think, elucidation of some very promising methodologies that are likely to transform, if not certainly further, the field of study. And then I think, you know, Ari was exactly onto something in revealing, I think, some of the innovative approaches one can take to familiar and often very perplexing and long-term frustrating issues like profiling. So this was a great panel. Thank you to all 3 of you. Any questions from the audience? Yes, Mark.
Hi, I just want to say thank you first to all the panelists and everyone who helped put this conference together. I'm actually thrilled to direct my question at the entire panel. We've talked a lot about jihadist terrorism in this conference, but since you all are so uniquely qualified, I was wondering if you might comment on what you thought of the trajectory of non-jihadist terrorism and the study of that going forward.
Should we just go down, Richard?
Yeah,
we'll start with you.
Thank you very much. It's a really important point. Understandably, particularly in the wake of 9/11, but with the cumulative effect of other developments as well, with the way in which across different global settings jihadist violence has become not only threatening but conspicuous, and with the intensification of the problem with regard to ISIS, there's been a deserved attention to jihadist violence. I think one of the great values of the Global Terrorism Database is that when you look across the universe of cases, you can see that, for example, 9/11 remains a remarkably unusual incident, and we shouldn't read everything else through the lens of that appalling attack, because so much else is different in terms of scale, in terms of motivation, in terms of the locational relationship to the people practicing it. My own approach to it is I think we need to do two things. One is, if you're writing about jihadist terrorism, you need to think about saying things which are going to be of value in terms of insights 10 years' time rather than just now. In other words, you can write about the contemporary, but think in terms of things that are going to be lastingly insightful in terms of your analysis. And also think, whichever kind of terrorism you're writing about, think about the family resemblances as well as the differences between one kind and another. So we've heard colleagues here talk about a variety of different kinds of terrorism, you know, Ari and Gary between them talking about Northern Ireland, about ETA, about the FMLN, about jihadists. I think there are some things which are distinctive and unique about each of those cases, and that's absolutely vital. You can't understand ETA without knowing what's unique and contextual about it. On the other hand, there are some things which are family resemblant, and to ignore those would be crazy. Every person in this room is unique. That doesn't mean there aren't some family resemblances between people which enable us to talk about humans. And so I think the same is true of terrorism. So I think we need to think, when we're doing analysis, of thinking in 10 years, in 20 years' time, will what I write about now still be relevant? Long after perhaps jihadism has ceased to be the primary concern. Books on jihadism that are any good, articles on it that are any good will still be insightful, but also to think about what makes each case unique as well as what's family resemblant across them.
Yeah, so this is I think a lot of us working in this area struggle with this because, I mean, there has been, I think, internationally a tremendous emphasis on the jihadist side of the fence. We have, I was thinking about this with Arya's presentation, that we have about 1,500 people from the United States who are convicted or killed in connection to a terrorist attack going all the way back into the 60s. And actually, the smallest group of those are jihadists. We have far more right-wing and left-wing. I shouldn't say far more. I think it breaks down something like probably 35, or somewhere less than 25 for the jihadist group. But it's so acute. We're actually doing interviews now in connection with this project, and the guy who's doing the interviews, Pete Simi, has been having difficulty finding jihadists in the United States, and partly that's because many of the ones that are here are in prison. But so it's clearly, there's, at least in the United States, and I mean this is true for other places. India is a great example of this. I mean, India is not just jihadist terrorism. Certainly there's still a very active left-wing groups, right-wing, and then sort of combinations of those as well. And I think, as Richard is pointing out, there could be important differences. There are, we know, important differences across those groups, and we can split them in a variety of different ways as well. So I know in the work we've started to do on the case for the United States, we're finding some similarities, but also lots of differences across these different ideological categories. So I think we're just beginning to scratch the surface on some of that work. In fact, there's a lot to be done there.
Yeah, so I think first of all, I think it's extremely beneficial to work in those areas which are less crowded, I guess. You know, so I think for you as a student, sometimes there's some significant advantages in looking into groups or social movements that gain less attention, because really this is where you can actually provide some more innovative insight sometimes and really identify some gaps in the existing knowledge. I think it's also, I'm someone that most of my career actually looked into other stuff. So I looked into Jewish terrorism, I looked into far-right groups, So I also studied a little bit some jihadist groups, but for me it was much more interesting, for example, to understand the American far-right, why people in the U.S. probably, a country which provide a lot of alternatives for violence, why people in this country feel the urge to use violent tactics in order to promote their political agenda, despite the fact that they have so many other alternative mechanisms to promote their political objectives. For me, it was a really fascinating question. So this is why I started to look into the American far right. And I think then when you start really looking into these kind of groups and these kind of arenas, then you identify really interesting complexities. And you find out, for example, that the skinheads are extremely different than, for example, the militias. Or that, the many white supremacy groups are very different than anti-abortion groups, for example. There's unique differences and complexities within these groups. And finally, I think there's something to say for comparative work. And if we really want to promote effective comparative work, we need also to look outside the jihadi landscape in order to, because there's some kind, those of us who are trained as comparativists know that there's sometimes you really need the comparative perspective in order to identify uniqueness in the data and some kind of paradoxical trends in the data, just when you have some kind of a comparative perspective. And in order to really to develop an actual comparative perspective, it's not enough sometimes just to compare between Islamist groups and non-jihadi Islamist groups and jihadi groups. Sometimes you really need to go outside of the jihadi landscape. So when people are talking about the uniqueness, for example, of the jihadi movement as a transnational movement that use illegal practices, I want to laugh because look, for example, into many of the environmental groups. They are also part of a transnational movement that use, in many cases, illegal practices, right? Are the jihadis really that unique? Probably not. We just need to be more open to these kind of similarities and differences and understanding that, that our ability to go outside of our comfort zone or what everybody are looking at have some unique advantages.
Hijab.
So my question's for any of you all, I guess. One of the things that's very encouraging is if you look at academic institutions that do study security studies or terrorism, you are seeing kind of, Professor English, you mentioned that only 1% of the people that are involved in scholarship about terrorism belong to the areas that are faced with the most terrorism. You're seeing a bit of a change in that in terms of academic environments. You have a lot of international students and some of the top sort of academic institutions that do study the topic. Where this becomes complicated is translating or transitioning from an academic setting into a professional one. So on a personal level, I have had a really hard time, for instance, transitioning from, I will graduate hopefully this May, but actually applying what I've studied into kind of the field, some of the organizations, some of the research departments that are at various federal agencies and so forth. It is impossible to actually, get through that obstacle of clearances and so forth, and actually use your expertise and use the fact that you belong to a certain area and have a familiarity with it for practical use. So how does that then impact the future of kind of the study of this topic?
Badly. The paradox of it, hijab, is that often the hurdles that you have bureaucratically to get access to certain kinds of employment are hurdles which have been introduced with the precise intention of limiting the amount of terrorism that you have in that country, whereas you have people who are very expert who can offer supreme guidance, but they can't get a visa to work in the country because of the anti-terrorism impulsion behind the visa regulation. So, good luck with that. For once, things are worse outside universities than in them, which is an unusual reality, but I think it is true. On the university basis, I think I would draw a distinction between the pluralism of international backgrounds that there is and the enduring basis of people in institutions in the countries that I'm talking about. So it's true that you have brilliant scholars who might be Colombian or Indian, but what you need to look at is the degree to which the dominant literature and the dominant institutions in our field as academic institutions have people who are based in Indian universities, in Pakistani universities, in Colombian universities, and so forth. And that, I think, is remaining and enduring a huge problem for reasons which are infrastructural and very difficult to do something about. It's easier to identify the problem than to do something about it. Where I think we could do slightly more about it is you can push some doors that'll open, and you should do so. So I think, for example, we could be more creative about the ways in which we think about soliciting articles from academics who work in some countries, which we don't at the moment. We could think about invitations to people to come and speak. Despite the visa regulations, we could think about opportunities for there to be people to visit back and forward. So I think there's more that can be done. I do think the university basis of people's academic work remains a problem. But once you get out into trying to get a job in the non-university worker world, it is even more difficult. And unfortunately, one of the things is in the wake of terrorist crises, there's sometimes a knee-jerk reaction to introduce sclerotic bureaucracy, which is intentioned quite well often, but makes often the very thing you're trying to stop more difficult to stop, for reasons which you're apparently very well aware with.
Yeah, I'll just chime in that generally I'm extremely optimistic about, as I pointed out in my talk about research, and this is actually an area that I'm not so optimistic about. I'm, in fact, maybe pessimistic. And because I don't think, I mean, I think the point is well made, and I don't see a huge amount of improvement. In fact, when our center started 12 years ago, we were specifically directed to be as international in our research projects as possible. And over time, that has really cut back so that particularly the Department of Homeland Security, I think, is increasingly only interested in domestic-related issues. I know our research agenda has gotten more nationalistic, not less, over time, which I think is a problem. So, I mean, if you look at, the people we're working with in Pakistan, India, I mean, leaving out, places like Syria and Libya, it's really difficult. You don't have infrastructure. I mean, the best I think you can hope for is to work with people like that, perhaps, and encourage them to work, perhaps, in other institutions. But I think that is an area where I have not seen a huge amount of progress over the last 12 years.
I think this is also related to the decline in field research on some level.
Perhaps.
Right? There's less and less inclination, especially by PhD students, to do actually the field work that is sometimes necessary, right? As a result, because you don't do the field work, you're missing the networking with local scholars, local practitioners, local experts who can really provide you some really important nuance and understanding that you will never get that through other means. So I think that's part of the problem. So I think, again, it's related to what I've said before. We have new tools. They don't necessarily need to come at the expense of the old, field work that some of us, still trying to do. So I think that's maybe one of the reasons why we see a bit of more difficulties to create some more diversity in the field and bring new people into the fold. In terms of the clearance, I'm not sure if that's what you intended, but I don't have a clearance. I'm at West Point. I think all my colleagues have a top secret clearance. I have to admit that I never felt that I'm in a disadvantage because of that. And my understanding is eventually, you shouldn't feel that you cannot produce an effective, relevant research just because you don't have TS clearance. Eventually, everything goes up. And so maybe you cannot do about a group that was active in the last 6 months because some of its operations are still, behind the wall. But so you can look into dynamics that occurred 3-4 years ago that now are more, there's more clarity about them, there's more data, and so on. I don't think that should be a worry.
Yes. Oh, there's a microphone coming.
When terrorist groups are constantly adapting and flexible, opportunistic in nature, how do you ensure that you're keeping the studies relevant and applicable? And actually, that was my original question. I'm going to shift it because I think this panel did a really good job of lending itself to answering parts of that question for me. But in turn, how does this dilemma shape your research or shape what should be researched and how?
Go the other way on that one.
Yeah. I think really you adapt your. I think it works both ways. You really, like I think most scholars, I guess all the time you reevaluate your explanations, your understanding, your theories, your concept, the way you think about the problem, right? And I can give you, an example from the usage of social network analysis, in terrorism studies. So 10 years ago, we were perfectly fine with having like a snapshot of the group, of its social network. That was considered a huge advancement, right, now that we're able to map the social ties within the group. Today, we understand the limitations of such a tool. We understand that groupers are extremely dynamic, social ties are extremely dynamic, so we need to develop tools that will enable us to catch the social structure of the group in different points in times, and to understand what the differences in their structure actually mean in terms of their behavior, in terms of their capabilities, and so on and so forth. So we're developing better tools. I think we just what we do is the most natural thing. I think we're evaluating the theoretical and conceptual framework that we're working with, as well as we are trying to all the time to improve the accuracy and the effectiveness of our methods, while understanding that really it's a really dynamic phenomenon. I would just be careful. We always have the tendency to see new things as necessarily as extremely unique and unequivalent and so on. There's a very interesting piece that was written by Marta Crenshaw in which she really challenging the entire concept of new terrorism. And basically she's showing that, some digging into the history of terrorism will show us that many of what we consider the new aspects, the new facets of terrorism are not necessarily new. So I think it's not bad to be a bit humble and be more careful when we're assuming that, all these changes are really something that we've never seen in the past,
Yeah, I have to smile on that since I've been working with Martha quite a bit because she's drilled that into me. I've become a true believer as well that, even now with the internet, I think there's some emerging evidence that, you do a study and you say, 70% of jihadists are using the internet, whereas 40% were using it 5 years ago. Well, that's true probably for grandparents, for everybody, basically. So I think we do jump sometimes too rapidly. On the other hand, I was thinking the other day, we wrote a proposal for Department of Homeland Security about 12 years ago originally for this center I'm directing. It's actually interesting as a historical document what doesn't appear in that proposal. Like, I don't think the term radicalization was even in there. So certainly the emphasis 10 or 12 years ago is quite a bit different, I think. ISIL wasn't on the horizon, 3 years ago, I guess, pretty recently anyway, so things are evolving. On the other hand, I'm amazed in some ways. I was reading an article the other day where the person was criticizing academia for being slow to respond, but you think about how much work is being put on right now on ISIL. That is, I think, not typical of academics in the past, where data that were 5 years old was no big deal, basically. I think we've actually gotten much more rapid in terms of evolving in this area than we have in others. I like the sort of consortium model that I think to some extent St. Andrews and Georgetown and we are sort of examples of that, so that with a broad network it's possible to pull in somebody who's an expert on Sri Lanka or an expert on Libya or wherever the particular area is, because one of the things we know, of course, are these problems do not stay in the same areas generally forever. They tend to crop up in different parts of the world. And so being able to get experts in those parts of the world pretty rapidly, I think, is really a good advantage of having a consortium.
I would agree very strongly with what both Ari and Gary have said. The 2 points I'd make to your question myself would be first that to some degree if you're studying something contemporaneous it's necessarily a moving target. So if, for example, one prays that there won't be, but if there were to be a large-scale ISIS-related attack in the United States during the next 6 months, research on ISIS would in all sorts of ways seem very different in terms of the dynamics of what you were describing and the implications. And I think that just comes with the territory of studying that which is contemporary. What I would say secondly, though, goes back to amplifying a point I made a moment ago, which is I think whatever you're writing about, whether it's about 19th century anarchist terrorism or contemporary ISIS terrorism or whatever, I think you do need as a scholar or an analyst to develop a really deep intuition for those insights which are going to be enduringly illuminating. In other words, I think you need to think about those things which are going to produce analysis which is not the functional equivalent of a tweet. I think you need something which is going to be worth reading in some time to come, because I think otherwise what we're producing is it's like those free newspapers you get on the tube in London. It's just something where you read it and you throw it down and you leave it, and that's not only not helpful, it's unhelpful. It's positively disastrous in some consequences, some of the consequences. So I think whatever you're studying, whether ancient or modern, you need to get some intuition, which means that what you're going to say is going to be of lasting value.
The job of the moderator is to flatter the panelists by introducing them and then direct question traffic and otherwise shut up. But let me just say one thing, if I could, because I disagree with some of the things that have been said here. I think, looking at the terrorism field, I think the academic terrorism field, it is remarkably conservative and not innovative. And in fact, research tends to lump together, and that's the biggest problem. Think about it. How many scholars were writing about Osama bin Laden before the 1998 embassy, even before, forget the embassy bombings, before 9/11? Peter Bergen had an article on Osama bin Laden that was rejected from every major journal and foreign policy publication, except for one before 9/11. Suicide terrorism. No one was writing about that, or hardly, very few people, before 9/11. And that's been one of the problems. I had a journal like Richard. I mean, we're inundated for years with articles on suicide terrorism. I mean, there's nothing new to say. So, I mean, one of the biggest problems, I think, is that the terrorism field itself is often very slow to change and is as responsive and reactive as the media and government is. I mean, an example I would say is very little work, I get no articles in my journal, very little work today is about terrorist use of unconventional weapons. That was more of a fashion some time ago. But that, to me, has become, for reasons we discussed this morning, with engineers coming on board and more scientists, with sanctuary and safe havens, it's potentially a very important forward-looking issue. And that, I think, has been the problem with the academic field, is it's more reactive and tends to clump rather than to be proactive. And now I'll shut up. Next question. Yes, sir.
Thanks.
Bernard, sorry.
Yeah, my question is, I guess, to Richard, but also, I think, to the other two, Gary and Ari. And you talked a lot about the kind of internal restrictions in the field, the things we can change, you know, improving the dialogue between the disciplines and so on. And I'm wondering if you could say a few words about the external restrictions. And I'm thinking about governmental restrictions, for instance, Prevent in the UK. Do you think this will be a growing concern, a growing problem and limitation for the field?
I think it is in jaggedly unpredictable ways. So partly, let's talk about two aspects of it. One is governmental aspects of things. So the paradox I find quite often is that there are certain actions that the state takes in terms of producing the context within which you can gain access to material, which get in the way of you doing first-hand original research. And then you're invited by the police or the army to go and do lectures to them on your original research because they want to know what you found. And the first thing you say is, look, it'd be much easier if you'd stop, you know, following me around the place or intercepting my phone calls. So there are things where there's a double message given. Prevent has been unfortunate in some cases because people have been doing research and they've been thought to be bad guys because they've been looking at things. I think the second thing is that sometimes there are things that the Boston College case in regard to the original research in regard to Northern Ireland and then the subpoena to try and get the material. I get quite a lot of contact from people who are researchers. This goes back to the point Harry was making about fieldwork, who are their doctoral students in America, not working on Northern Ireland, working on Columbia, working on whatever, whose doctoral advisors have said to them in the light of the problems which the Boston College case brought up about what you do with interview material and what if the police try and get hold of it, they've been advised not to do fieldwork. So in that case, sometimes a combination of the police, the university in question, the legal processes have made it more difficult to do the work. Having said that, Bernhard, there are external restraints to all sorts of very valuable research that we do. When people are doing criminological research, there are issues with regard to that. Health research, there are issues with regard to that. Climate change research, there are external impediments which are difficult. And often there are commercial interests which make it difficult. I think what we should try and do is to maintain as much space as we can. And linking your question with Bruce's point about the conservatism of how academic institutions and academics respond to the issue. It seems to me what we need to do is to guard the capacity for a pluralistic space for inquiry. I think sometimes universities do say, everyone's now talking about this, so all we'll study at the moment, or all we'll appoint people in at the moment is this interesting issue, but rather than looking at more lateral things. Similarly, I think sometimes the funding for research is targeted at very present-centered considerations, and I think a more long-term funding process would be more useful. Quite often the most innovative research is produced not when someone says, here's an area we need answers in, but where you just fund someone brilliant to come up with ideas. And I think quite often that kind of unpredictable research generates insights. But I think even though there are problems, I think in the UK or in the US, for example, where most of the people in this room would be based, it's still a very productive context within which to do work, despite the kind of things that you're mentioning. Other countries, of course, it's very, very different.
Yeah, in terms of restrictions, I actually just have been experiencing one that is frustrating and that doesn't seem to be getting any better, which is institutional review boards, which we have a database, as I mentioned, of about 1,500 Americans that have been convicted or killed. And the most extreme example is, and I'm not making this up, it's a true story. The original Global Terrorism Database, when we had it archived with the ICPSR at the University of Michigan, which is this huge warehouse for data, we had to scrub Osama bin Laden's name out of it. because of human subjects issues, which this is a true story. So, and you know, we're working right now, I don't know if we have some folks here from the European Union, but we're working here with this Proton project. And if you think the American IRB process is convoluted, this one is really crazy. So like I was listening to Ari's presentation, and we've got a database that we could do some of the things you're talking about, like network analysis, but it's actually much more complicated because we haven't been able to easily record the names of everybody that shows up in the data. So that is an issue for sure. And you know, of course, you can argue personal freedom and other sorts of issues as well, as people do, but I think that is actually a bit of a problem. And then I think I wanted to also mention this, I guess this isn't a government problem, it's an academic problem, but it came up earlier and I think it's worth emphasizing, that I think it's actually very difficult in our individual silos to publish interdisciplinary work. Okay. I mean, we rely on the likes of the journal editors at the table who do interdisciplinary work. But if you just send a straight interdisciplinary piece to political science or sociology or psychology, I think there's still a real bias against publishing those. And I don't know if that's actually getting better. Maybe it is.
It's actually getting worse.
Maybe you could argue that.
Yeah, I think I think there's several levels. So if we're talking about the academic journals, so, you know, I recently submitted a piece to one of the top poli-sci journals, and the response that I got is that the piece doesn't focus on a contemporary controversial issue or contemporary issue. And I was thinking, so how can you develop new ideas, new issues for discourse, or, you know, that means that we need to stick to the same 5, 6 issues that IR are focusing on for the last 40 years. Right. And that shows that conservatism doesn't exist just in terrorism study, Bruce, but also outside our field in many ways. And if you're really trying to publish terrorism stuff in the top IR platforms, you'll find the same challenges, I think.
Unless you make it incredibly quantitative, because that's the new fashion.
Yeah, true. Yeah. And I think what we need to be worried about is self-censoring, actually. I think sometimes we tend to not develop projects just because we think that, you know, that the relevant agencies or the relevant actors won't be interested in. And actually, sometimes these are the issues that it's actually beneficial to do a bit more of explorations, because for most issues that we are studying, someone at the government is interested in. You know, I did a project on political assassination, which I wasn't sure who will care about it in the government, but, you know, eventually, whether it was the Secret Service and other agencies were actually highly interested in some of the stuff that we did. So I think it's just a bit more effort in identifying how exactly you can really associate what you're interested in and what you're passionate about with some aspect that may interest some, you know, other actors that may fund your research or provide you data or some. Usually, very rarely you cannot find the right link. It demands some effort, but, you know, rarely I found that, you know, there's especially as terrorism scholars, that we cannot find the right link to, you know, to someone within the government that may be interested in some of the things that we do. And sometimes you're surprised. Sometimes it's just, you know, it's post facto, you know. So when just after I did my far-right research, I found out how much that was of interest for law enforcement and so on. And then you just need to go with your guts and just believe that this is important.
Yes. Tom.
Could I pick up just a little bit on this theme? In the academic realm, which all of you represent, to what extent does multidisciplinary collaboration take place in research on terrorism? In other words, are you drawing upon the social sciences, the humanities, the hard scientists, government, politics, economics, philosophy, religious studies, computer sciences, communications, information technologies, cybersecurity, cyber warfare, all of that? Does that draw into the work that's being done and in the future of studies on terrorism?
That's an impressive list of
That is.
disciplines there. I mean, I think I'll tell you a little bit about what we do at St Andrews, and for all of its it'll exemplify some of the limitations, but some of the possibilities. The centre that I direct, which Bruce co-founded in the 1990s, is housed within a School of International Relations, but the disciplines from which people have come in terms of their training at various points include political science, IR, history, ancient history, anthropology, theology, and so on. So you can have small teams, but you do it kind of, in my experience, you almost do it undercover and without the university noticing until it's a success, and then they say, oh, that's what we wanted all along. But I think if you try to start it out and say, this is what you're going to do, you'd find difficulties. I think it can be done, and I think colleagues at the table here work in similar situations where you can get collaborative work. I think it's necessary, and I think it's hugely productive. I think the second point about it, though, is that it remains less common than would be ideal, and there are some big barriers. So, for example, the arts and humanities and social science dialogue is difficult enough, but by the time you get to the people who are in the electronic communications and information technology bit of the firm, the cross-referencing there is much less common. And I mentioned in my talk that, you know, when a neuroscientist writes a book about torture and counter-terrorism, it's less likely immediately to be in the bloodstream of the reading lists than it would be if it was in a different discipline. I think we should be as pluralistic as possible. The challenge is that because we all are trying to work within certain career stovepipes, there are imperatives to work within them in order to get promotion and all the rest of it. And it's difficult for younger scholars to get advantage through being multidisciplinary in their approach, even though intellectually it's creative. I think the second thing is that it's just time. I mean, you know, time and expertise to be multilingual in terms of disciplines is very, very difficult, because I think to keep up with one sub-bit of one discipline is hard enough, but to read across them, to get into the philosophical debates about the ticking time bomb situation and torture, to read what the anthropologists are writing about Afghanistan, to read what the sociologists are writing about Italy. You know, you just, you know, even if you don't sleep much, it's very difficult to keep up, and I think it's therefore more rare. What I do think is that quite often the most lasting innovations in the work come when someone is kind of slightly transgressive from one discipline into another, and then afterwards everyone says, oh, that was the way it should always have been, and it becomes an orthodoxy. But I think sometimes those brilliant maverick transgressors ask questions which therefore detonate explosions, to use an appropriate metaphor, and then we get more interesting questions emerging.
Yeah, I was going to just say, when you gave that whole list about our center, I was going to just say yes. I mean, we do have that, and I love working at the place because of that, because you're likely to run into not just a social scientist, but an engineer, mathematician, et cetera, et cetera. I think basically my sense is universities above the department level really get the importance of interdisciplinary work. Funding agencies are moving in that direction. Departments, though, are very traditional, I think, and very, at least I think at state universities, departments are very strong, too, and do a lot to sort of direct the culture. So I find like my departmental life is completely different than my institute life, where there is much more interdisciplinary work. And despite that, though, I think it still is challenging, because fields are still, journals to some large extent are still organized along disciplinary lines. I don't want to sound too depressed about it. I think Ari was getting this point too. I think there are things that are showing up in psychology and in departmental outlets, but it is a bit difficult sometimes, and I think you have to think about that. And I think one of the issues, like we're running into this all the time with, if you want to download 2 billion tweets a day, I don't know how to just go and do that. I've had to, we had to hire we'd had to hire software experts, we'd had to hire computer specialists. I mean, we're getting into more and more areas where, and I think it's the case that one department certainly doesn't have all of the brain power. So I think actually, maybe this area more than many others, though, does have a lot of interdisciplinary work going on. So I think it's quite exciting, actually.
I think it's probably we'll see more cooperation within the social sciences, so sociologists, economists, political scientists, anthropologists, probably cooperating all the time, and these disciplines are fairly close, so I think it's easier. If you want really to develop a more intensive multidisciplinary approach that will really go outside of the social science, I think you really need to restructure the incentive structure. Because as long as your promotion is really based on your ability to publish in my case, for example, poli-sci journals, it will be more difficult for me to invest time and energy in cooperating with someone who is focusing on, that is a computer science experts or something like that, because eventually I won't get credit for that, or at least not an equivalent credit. So I think if you really want to encourage it, at some point you really need to make some kind of a systematic reform in the way we are incentivize those who are studying these issues. I think also that eventually what we see today, because of the difficulties to master these different disciplines, you really see cooperation that really is supposed to complement the skill set of the various actors. So I'm cooperating now with a group of agri-economists, subfield that I didn't know that exist even before I started to cooperate with them. And they're looking into the impact of famine on the emergence of insurgency groups in developing countries, for example. So, I have no idea how you can really measure, for example, access to food or stuff like that, or what are the right tools to measure that, for example, but they can provide me some tools to measure that. So I think it's beneficial, especially when we really can complement the skill set of each other. But again, when we're going even farther, outside of the social sciences, then it becomes more tricky. I agree with my colleagues.
True.
Kate, we'll give you the last question.
Hi, so this is kind of a similar question, but from a different perspective. But I actually did my undergrad at St. Andrews, but I did my degree in social anthropology. And I didn't know anybody who was able to do a joint degree in IR and anthropology, and it was unfortunately because I think a lot of the classes overlapped at the same time. So short of working on a different schedule that allows for that, what are some areas where we're able to incorporate these different disciplines for the young scholars, as you say, so that we're getting this different perspective, and hopefully that allows people to kind of come up and approach these topics in different ways?
I think the organizational logistic issue that you're mentioning there, running any big organization is very difficult in terms of timetables and competitive imperatives that the anthropologists will have as opposed to people in IR. I would hope it's the case at a university like St. Andrews and at the institutions which all four of us certainly work at, that there are ways in which lateral movement is at least partially possible. So sometimes we have students who, at CSTPV, where I'm the director, will have a series of public events. I always make sure that the ones for the fall are announced in August and the ones for the spring are announced in December, and it's widely disseminated. So if people do want to come from other parts of the firm, they can come and engage in at least that, and that there'll be an open door policy in terms of dissertation supervision or engagement in informal networks. But in terms of if you're doing one program and it overlaps with the classes in another program, that's just one of those difficult things, like trying to watch two films at the same time in the same cinema. It's difficult to do, and I've got no answer for that. But I do think there are lateral bits of movement. I think also if you've done an undergraduate in anthropology, you can then develop subsequent ways of pursuing the study. And now universities, including my own, are being quite innovative in terms of certain kinds of distance learning mechanisms which are part-time for professionals, so there are ways in which you can engage in the study of things. I think between various institutions in the UK and US, certainly, there are ways of trying to build certain new developments of professional engagement, academically, educationally, which might fit professional life. So I hope there are some ways around it. I'm old, and I really believe in books. Okay, there's an awful lot to be said. Okay, for getting a shelf of books, a kind of tutorials worth reading list of books on a particular topic, and just using all the time when you're boiling your kettle, when you're waiting in security line at an airport, when you're on a plane, when you're on a train, just using that time. And that kind of old-fashioned way of doing things, despite all the social media we now have, there are some things you can only get from a book, right? And I think that kind of knowledge is still something which universities produce in ways without which we're all impoverished. So I would strongly recommend that, not just because I write books. Though, ... But I think there are ways in which you can keep informal networks of learning going.
Yeah, I wanted to pivot on something that Aryeh said earlier, which I think it's probably easier to work within sort of kindred fields. Like it's probably easier for a sociologist to work with a political scientist than an engineer. And I was sort of chuckling a little bit, because I'm actually working on a project right now with a group of engineers in a center called Alert. And they're developing this app that is supposed to alert people when something bad is taking place, so that perhaps they could use the social media to ameliorate or mitigate the harm or the damage done before police or emergency people even get there. And I've been struck by, we just talk such different languages. It's been a bit of a struggle, and I don't think, I'm learning a hell of a lot about it, but I think it's more difficult than in a field like in the social sciences or behavioral sciences. That said, though, I don't know who made this, I think Richard made this comment. I do think a lot of real discoveries and a lot of exciting pushes forward do happen sort of between fields, you know, in areas that have been perhaps neglected, where you just get a very different insight by working with someone from another field. So I really would recommend trying to do that, but as you go into it, I think the farther they are from your home field, the more difficult. It's probably like learning a language that isn't, you know, if you're in a Romance language, learning a language from another language group is probably going to be more difficult, but it might be very worthwhile.
Just related to that, one of the main challenges is that even within the social sciences, there's subfields that are disconnected. So if you're looking, for example, into the literature of civil war, which is completely disconnected from the literature of terrorism, right? Despite the fact that we can say, I think, arguably that the most terrorist acts today are being conducted in the context of some kind of a civil war, right?
Yeah.
But there's a significant disconnect between the two literatures. And so I think we also need to be conscious that even within the social sciences, despite all the recent cooperation between, you know, people from different fields, there's still some niches that are still, I think it's very beneficial to explore their, you know, the potential of cooperation, you know, between them, I guess.
Well, that brings us to the end. Let me make one observation that's certainly on the positive side. I mean, we've rightly paid obeisance and homage to Martha Crenshaw, who's the doyenne of this field and a giant in the field, but I think all of us at a certain age remember when Martha was the only woman in the field. And this is the only panel in this conference that has not had a woman on it. When I look out at the audience, there's an equal number of men and women, which is transforming the terrorism studies field as well, I think in very important and significant ways. So that's certainly a step forward. Please join me, firstly, in thanking the panelists. Those were really three extraordinarily rich and meaningful presentations, and I'm really grateful to all three of you. And finally, in thanking David Maxwell, the Associate Director of the Security Studies Program, Olivia Albright and Vanway of the SSP staff, and of course, the magnificent and inimitable Andrea Kleibau, who really orchestrates all of these things. So thanks to all of you for making this possible and for everyone who traveled here for this conference.